You might think the greatest mysteries of the ancient world lie buried beneath desert sands or hidden in jungle temples, far from the reach of modern civilization. You'd expect them to be guarded by time and distance, preserved in exotic locations that require expeditions and funding and years of careful excavation. But what if I told you that some of the most baffling archaeological enigmas in human history were deliberately destroyed? What if the answers to questions that have haunted scholars for centuries went up in flames, consumed by fire in a single catastrophic moment? Tonight, we're diving into the burned archives of history, those irreplaceable collections of knowledge that vanished before we ever had the chance to read them. These aren't just stories about ancient libraries reduced to ash or civilizations that disappeared without explanation. These are tales of deliberate destruction, accidental catastrophe, and mysteries so profound that even the fragments that survived raise more questions than they answer. We're talking about entire chapters of human history that were erased, languages that died with their last speakers, and secrets that were guarded so carefully that they were ultimately lost forever. Picture yourself standing in the ruins of a great library, the smell of charred papyrus still hanging in the air, your fingers brushing against the edge of a clay tablet whose message will never be fully understood. Imagine the weight of knowing that the answers you seek were right here, preserved for centuries, only to be consumed by flame before anyone could translate them. Throughout this journey, we'll walk through 6 extraordinary mysteries, each one connected by fire, loss, and the maddening proximity of knowledge that slipped through humanity's fingers. You'll meet the scholars who dedicated their lives to piecing together fragments, the explorers who stumbled upon ruins that shouldn't exist, and the theories, from the plausible to the fantastical, that attempt to explain what we've lost. Some of these mysteries involve advanced civilizations whose very existence challenges our understanding of prehistory. Others center on artifacts so strange that they seem to defy the technological limitations of their age. And yes, we'll encounter tales of giants, ancient voyagers who crossed impossible oceans, and lost tribes whose descendants might still walk among us, carrying secrets in their blood. By the end of this hour, you'll understand why these burned archives matter, why the destruction of knowledge is perhaps humanity's greatest tragedy, and why some secrets might be better left buried. So settle in, because we're about to explore the shadows between what we know and what we'll never know, where history meets mystery, and the only certainty is that certainty itself is an illusion. The Great Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building. It was the beating heart of ancient knowledge, a repository that held somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million scrolls, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of human understanding. Founded around 283 BC by Ptolemy Isoter in the Egyptian city that bore Alexander the Great's name, this institution represented something revolutionary for its time: the systematic collection and preservation of all human knowledge. Scholars traveled from across the known world to study there, and every ship that docked at Alexandria's harbor was required by law to surrender any books or scrolls it carried so they could be copied for the library's collection. The originals were often kept, and the copies returned to their owners, but that's beside the point. What matters is the ambition, the sheer audacity of trying to gather everything humanity had ever written in one place. The library complex itself was enormous, sprawling across multiple buildings with reading rooms, lecture halls, gardens, and even a zoo. It was part of the Mausoleum, or museum, a research institution dedicated to the muses, and it attracted the brightest minds of the age. Mathematicians like Euclid, astronomers like Aristarchus, inventors like Archimedes during his visits, poets, philosophers, geographers who were mapping a world that still held infinite mysteries. The head librarian was often one of the most respected scholars of the age, and the position came with tremendous prestige and responsibility. These weren't just caretakers, they were the guardians of human memory itself. But here's where it gets tricky. We don't actually know how the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. The traditional story, the one you might have learned in school, tells of Julius Caesar accidentally setting fire to the harbor in 48 BC during his military campaign against Ptolemy XIII, with flames spreading to consume the library's main building and its irreplaceable contents. It's a neat narrative. One man's military miscalculation becomes the greatest intellectual catastrophe in human history. Except that's probably not what happened, or at least not the whole story. Ancient sources are maddeningly contradictory on this point. Some suggest that only warehouses near the harbor burned, destroying perhaps 40,000 scrolls that were awaiting export, but leaving the main library intact. Others claim the library survived Caesar's fire only to be damaged or destroyed by subsequent attacks. The sacking of the city by Emperor Aurelian in 270 CE, the destruction ordered by Coptic Pope Theophilus in 391 CE as part of a campaign against pagan temples, or the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE. Though that last claim comes from sources written centuries after the fact and is widely disputed by modern historians. The reality is probably more mundane and more tragic. The Library of Alexandria likely died not in a single spectacular blaze but through gradual decline, budget cuts, civil unrest, shifting political priorities, and the slow erosion of institutional support over centuries. The fire that we imagine, with scholars desperately trying to rescue scrolls from the flames while the world's knowledge turns to ash, probably never happened in quite that dramatic fashion. But something was undeniably lost, and the scale of that loss is almost incomprehensible. Think about what might have been on those shelves. We know the library held copies of Homer's epics, the complete works of the Greek tragedians, mathematical treatises that we've only recovered in fragments, star charts that map constellations we can barely reconstruct, medical texts whose remedies we can only guess at, and the histories of cultures that have left almost no other trace. There were scrolls in Egyptian, Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, Persian, Sanskrit, and languages we can't even name because they died with their last speakers. There were the complete works of Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote a comprehensive history of Mesopotamia that we now know only through scattered quotations in other authors' works. There was Manethos Aegyptiaca, the definitive history of the Egyptian dynasties, which we possess only in corrupted excerpts. There were treatises on technology and engineering, descriptions of inventions and innovations that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. And there were mysteries within mysteries, texts that hinted at older texts, references to sources that even the Alexandrian scholars considered ancient, fragments of knowledge from civilizations that had already fallen into legend by the time Ptolemy I opened the library's doors. Some scholars believe the library held copies of Phoenician sailing records that might have documented voyages to the Americas centuries before Columbus. Others suggest it contained star charts from Babylonian astronomers whose observations were so precise they couldn't be matched until the invention of the telescope. There are even wilder theories: that the library held the secrets of the Egyptian pyramid builders, that it contained maps of Antarctica as it appeared before the ice, that it preserved the technological knowledge of Atlantis or other lost civilizations whose very existence is debated. We can't know what was lost because we have no complete catalog of the library's holdings, and even the partial catalogs that existed were themselves destroyed. Picture yourself walking through those halls in, say, 50 BC, after Caesar's fire but before the final decline. The smell of papyrus and ink fills the air, mingling with the scent of cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls. Sunlight streams through high windows, illuminating dust motes that dance in the beams like golden snow. You pass scholars hunched over reading tables, fingers tracing lines of text in languages you don't recognize, lips moving silently as they copy or translate. In one corner, a mathematician is working through a geometric proof, using a straight edge to draw perfect lines in the sand of a teaching tray. In another, a geographer is consulting multiple sources to improve his map of the world, adding details from the reports of travelers and merchants. You reach up to pull a scroll from its pigeonhole, carefully unrolling it to reveal columns of Greek text, and as you read, you realize you're looking at an eyewitness account of Alexander's campaigns, written by someone who marched beside him. Or perhaps it's a medical text describing surgical procedures that won't be attempted again for 1,000 years. Or a philosophical dialogue that challenges ideas you thought were settled. The knowledge at your fingertips is literally incalculable, and yet within a few generations, most of it will be gone, surviving only as footnotes in the works of later scholars who had access to sources that no longer exist. The tragedy isn't just that the scrolls burned, it's that we can never fully inventory what was lost. We know there are gaps in our knowledge, entire fields of ancient study that are now blank spaces in our understanding, but we can't always identify what's missing because we don't know it ever existed. It's like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle when you don't know how many pieces there should be or what the final picture looks like. Still, for all the evidence we've gathered, for all the painstaking work of historians and archaeologists who've tried to reconstruct the library's collections from citations and references in surviving texts, we still don't know the full extent of what was lost or how it was lost. We have theories, educated guesses, scholarly debates that can turn surprisingly heated, but no definitive answers. And perhaps that's fitting, because the Library of Alexandria has become more than a historical fact. It's a symbol, a reminder of how fragile knowledge is and how easily the accumulated wisdom of centuries can vanish. The burned archive of Alexandria haunts us precisely because it represents all the other archives that have burned, all the other repositories of knowledge that were destroyed by war, neglect, zealotry, or simple accident. Every time we rediscover a text we thought was lost, every time we translate a fragment that sheds new light on the ancient world, we're reminded of how much more might be waiting to be found, or might be lost forever beneath layers of time and ash. The Indus Valley civilization flourished from approximately 3300 to 1300 BC across what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and eastern Afghanistan, covering an area of around 1.25 million square kilometers, making it the largest of the four ancient civilizations of the world, surpassing even ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in geographical extent. At its peak around 2600 to 1900 BC, this Bronze Age culture boasted cities with populations of up to 80,000 people, featuring sophisticated urban planning with grid-patterned streets, advanced drainage systems, standardized fired brick construction, and multi-story buildings with remarkably uniform architecture. The two largest cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, have been extensively excavated, revealing a society with impressive technological achievements, granaries, public baths, dockyard facilities, standardized weights and measures, and even evidence of dentistry and metallurgy. Trade networks extended from Central Asia to Mesopotamia, with Indus seals found as far away as Sumerian cities, indicating robust commercial relationships. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, measuring 12 meters by 7 meters and 2.4 meters deep, is lined with bricks sealed with bitumen and might have had ritual or ceremonial significance. The city layouts show a concern for public health that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Roman Empire, with covered drains along every street and private wells in individual homes. But here's where it gets really mysterious: we cannot read their writing. The Indus script appears on thousands of artifacts, seals, pottery, bronze implements, ivory and bone objects, typically in short inscriptions of just 3 to 6 symbols. Scholars have identified somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct signs, though exact counts vary depending on whether certain variations are considered separate symbols or variants of the same character. The script hasn't been conclusively deciphered despite more than a century of attempts, and this failure to crack the code means we don't know what language these people spoke, what their cities were actually called, the names we use are modern inventions, what their religious beliefs were, how their government was structured, or even what they called themselves. Every civilization we can read has left us texts that open windows into their worldview, their myths, their laws, their poetry, their history. The Indus people left us silence punctuated by tantalizing symbols we can't interpret. Some researchers argue that the Indus script isn't actually a writing system at all but rather a series of non-linguistic symbols, similar to heraldic crests or religious iconography. Others insist it's definitely a script, possibly representing an early Dravidian language, or perhaps a language isolate that has no living descendants. Attempts to use computer analysis and statistical methods to crack the code have produced contradictory results. Some patterns suggest the symbols are organized like a written language, with frequency distributions and positional patterns similar to known scripts. Other analyses claim these patterns could just as easily represent symbolic notation rather than linguistic text. Now, let's be fair about what makes this such a profound mystery. It's not just that we can't read the script, it's that the Indus Valley civilization appears to have been deliberately non-expressive in ways that baffle archaeologists. Unlike their contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they left no monumental inscriptions, no boastful declarations of kings' victories, no temple walls covered with religious texts, no administrative archives of clay tablets. The longest known Indus inscription contains just 34 symbols, found on the Dalavira signboard, and even that is debated. Most inscriptions are just 3 to 5 symbols long. What were they writing? Names? Titles? Clan affiliations? Trade information? Religious mantras? We simply don't know, and without longer texts to work with, decipherment becomes exponentially more difficult. It's like trying to learn an unknown language when all you have are business cards and luggage tags. The frustrating thing is that they clearly had the capability to create more extensive texts. They just chose not to, or the longer texts were written on perishable materials that haven't survived. Some scholars speculate that the Indus people might have written primarily on palm leaves or birch bark or cotton cloth, organic materials that would have decomposed completely in the region's climate, leaving only the brief inscriptions on durable materials like stone and metal. If that's true, then we've lost not just individual texts but entire genres of writing, their literature, their history, their administrative records, their scientific and religious texts. An entire archive burned not by fire but by time and moisture, and the relentless decay of organic matter. The decline of the Indus Valley civilization around 1900 to 1300 BC is itself shrouded in mystery. The cities weren't conquered by invading armies. There's no evidence of widespread warfare or destruction. Instead, they seem to have been gradually abandoned, with people migrating away from the major urban centers. Climate change is one popular theory. Shifts in monsoon patterns or the drying up of the Sarasvati River, which some researchers believe was a major waterway that supported numerous settlements before it disappeared. Others point to ecological degradation, overuse of timber for brick firing leading to deforestation, or overgrazing by domesticated animals causing soil erosion. There's also evidence of flooding and earthquake damage in some cities. But the truth is, we're speculating based on physical evidence while lacking the historical narratives that might explain what was happening. We can see the symptoms but not diagnose the disease because the patient left no medical records. And here's where it gets into the realm of the mythic and speculative. Some alternative historians claim the Indus script contains references to advanced technologies or connections to other ancient civilizations. There are theories that link Indus symbols to Easter Island's Rongorongo script, despite the 12,000 kilometers and 3,000 years separating them. Others claim to have identified references to flying machines or nuclear warfare in later Vedic texts, suggesting the Indus people possessed knowledge far beyond what mainstream archaeology acknowledges. One particularly persistent myth involves the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro showing evidence of vitrification, rocks melted by intense heat, which has led to speculation about ancient nuclear weapons, though actual geologists attribute such features to natural processes like lightning strikes or the ancient brick-firing techniques. Then there are the so-called skeletons of Mohenjo-Daro, a group of skeletal remains that conspiracy theorists claim show evidence of sudden death from intense heat or radiation, though archaeologists note that these remains are from different time periods and show no unusual features. Picture yourself as an Indus merchant in 2500 BC. Preparing a shipment of carnelian beads and cotton cloth bound for the markets of Ur in Mesopotamia. You reach for your seal, a small square of steatite carved with your mark, perhaps a bull or an elephant above a line of script. You press it into the clay ceiling on a large storage jar, leaving an impression that will identify the goods as yours. But what do those symbols actually say? Is it your name? Your guild affiliation? A prayer to your gods for safe travels? A description of the contents? A warning against tampering? You know, of course, because this is your culture, your language, but 4,000 years later, scholars will stare at the impression of your seal in museums from Delhi to London to Washington, and they will have no idea what you were trying to communicate. They'll photograph it, measure it, compare it to hundreds of other seals, feed the symbols into computer databases, and still come no closer to understanding your world. They'll debate whether you even had kings or whether your society was governed by councils of merchants or priests. They'll wonder whether you worshipped many gods or one, whether you had social hierarchies or relative equality, whether your lack of palaces and monuments indicates egalitarianism or simply different priorities than your Egyptian and Mesopotamian neighbors. And all because the archive of your civilization, whatever form it took, has been consumed not by flame but by the slower fire of time, leaving only these maddening fragments that speak without being understood. The debate over the Indus script touches on something deeply human, our need to know that knowledge will survive, that our words will be read, that we won't be forgotten. The Indus people accomplished extraordinary things, engineering marvels, artistic achievements, a civilization that endured for over 1,000 years. But they remain fundamentally unknowable to us in ways that the Sumerians and Egyptians are not. We still don't know their stories, their songs, their explanations of the cosmos, their understanding of themselves. And unless some miraculous discovery produces a bilingual inscription or a cache of long-form texts in a protected environment, we may never know. The burned archive of the Indus Valley isn't a building reduced to ash, it's an entire worldview erased, a language forgotten, a people rendered mute by the passage of time. The Mayan civilization of Mesoamerica reached heights of astronomical sophistication, architectural achievement, mathematical innovation, and artistic expression that rivaled any culture in the ancient world, flourishing from approximately 2000 BCE to 1500 CE across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. At their peak during the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, the Maya built cities with towering pyramid temples like El Castillo at Chichen Itza, which stands 30 meters high and contains 91 steps on each of its 4 sides that, combined with the top platform, total 365, matching the days of the solar year. Their city of Tikal covered more than 60 square kilometers and had a population estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000 people. They developed the only fully realized writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, created the mathematical concept of zero independently of Old World mathematicians, and maintained astronomical observations so precise that their calculation of the lunar cycle was accurate to within 33 seconds of what modern scientists have determined. Their long count calendar tracked time from a mythical creation date in 3114 BC, and they could calculate planetary positions thousands of years into the future. They domesticated crops like maize, cacao, and vanilla, built complex irrigation systems and raised agricultural fields, established trade networks that moved jade, obsidian, and quetzal feathers across vast distances, and created art of breathtaking beauty in jade, limestone, stucco, wood, and ceramics. But here's the tragedy. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors and Catholic missionaries systematically destroyed almost the entire corpus of Mayan written knowledge. Bishop Diego de Landa, the Franciscan friar who served as the colonial bishop of Yucatan, wrote that in July 1562 at Mani, he gathered all the Mayan codices, screenfold books made from bark paper coated with lime wash, and burned them in a huge bonfire because they contained nothing in which there was not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil. By his own account, he destroyed 27 hieroglyphic rolls, though the actual number was probably much higher, and countless other books were burned by other zealous missionaries across the Mayan territories. Today, only 4 pre-Columbian Mayan codices survive: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the recently authenticated Grolier Codex, now renamed the Maya Codex of Mexico. That's it. From what was likely thousands or tens of thousands of books covering every aspect of Mayan knowledge, their history, mythology, astronomical tables, medical practices, agricultural techniques, ritual procedures, poetry, and more, we have 4 partial manuscripts. The Dresden Codex, considered the most complete and best preserved, contains 74 pages and focuses primarily on astronomical and astrological tables. It includes calculations for Venus cycles, eclipse predictions, and New Year ceremonies. The Madrid Codex, with 112 pages, deals with almanacs and horoscopes, rituals, and ceremonies. The Paris Codex, just 22 pages, concerns rituals and prophecies. The Grolier Codex, only 10 pages and badly damaged, appears to show Venus cycles. These surviving texts are invaluable, but they represent perhaps 1% or less of what once existed. The irony is that Diego de Landa also wrote Relation de las Cosas de Yucatán, an account of Mayan culture and history that became one of our most important sources for understanding the Maya, including a description of their writing system and calendar that proved crucial to later decipherment efforts. The man who destroyed the books also created the key to reading them, recognizing too late that he had erased something precious. His writings suggest he came to regret the book burning, at least to some degree, but the damage was done. What was in those burned books? We can only piece together hints from the surviving codices, from inscriptions carved on stone monuments and buildings, from the accounts of early Spanish observers, and from the oral traditions that Mayan people have maintained into the present day. But there were clearly extensive histories, genealogies of ruling families, accounts of wars and alliances, descriptions of creation myths beyond the fragments preserved in the Popol Vuh, which was transcribed into Roman letters in the 16th century and is our best source for kitsch Maya mythology. There were detailed astronomical observations going back centuries, recording not just the movements of Venus and eclipses but possibly comets, supernovas, and other celestial phenomena. There were medical texts with herbal remedies and surgical procedures. There were agricultural manuals with planting calendars and weather prediction methods. There were ritual instructions for ceremonies we can only glimpse through archaeology. And there were arts now lost, narrative literature, poetry, philosophical treatises, whatever the Mayan equivalent of Homer or Hesiod might have been. Now, let's talk about what we've managed to recover and what remains mysterious. The decipherment of Mayan hieroglyphic writing is itself a detective story spanning centuries, from the partial breakthroughs of the 19th century through the revolutionary work of scholars like Yuri Norizov in the 1950s and 60s, who demonstrated that the script was a combination of logographic and syllabic signs, to modern epigraphers who can now read approximately 90% of known Mayan texts. But here's the thing, most of what survives is monumental inscriptions on buildings and stelae, which focus on political propaganda, royal genealogies, and major events. They're the ancient equivalent of highway billboards and commemorative plaques, important, yes, but hardly representative of the full range of Mayan literary expression. The day-to-day administrative documents, the personal letters, the works of literature and science, those were in the codices, and those are what we've lost. It's as if some future archaeologist tried to understand our civilization based solely on the inscriptions in the Washington Monument, Mount Rushmore, and war memorials, without access to books, letters, newspapers, or digital records. They'd know some names, some dates, some events, but they'd miss the texture of lived experience, the debates and contradictions, the full complexity of thought. There are persistent legends among the Maya about hidden libraries, caves or buildings where ancient priests concealed books before the Spanish conquest, waiting for a day when they could be safely brought out. Some of these stories speak of vast underground chambers filled with codices, preserved in the stable environment of limestone caves. Archaeologists have actually found significant artifacts in caves. The Maya used them for ritual purposes and sometimes for burial, but no hidden libraries have ever been discovered. Still, the legends persist, and every so often someone claims to have found evidence of undiscovered Mayan texts. In 2016, archaeology students using LiDAR technology discovered what appeared to be a sealed chamber in a pyramid at Chichen Itza, leading to speculation about hidden treasures, though subsequent investigation found no evidence of a book cache. The reality is that if such repositories exist, they've eluded discovery for 5 centuries despite intensive archaeological work across the Maya region. More likely, any books that weren't burned either decayed in the humid tropical environment, or were lost to looting and the general upheaval of the colonial period. Still, there's something appealing about the idea that somewhere, in a cave system not yet explored or in a chamber not yet opened, there's a library waiting to be found, books wrapped in jaguar skins or sealed in pottery jars, protected from moisture and time, ready to tell us what the Mayan knew and thought and dreamed about. Picture yourself in a Mayan city during the 8th century, perhaps in Tikal or Palenque, during the height of the classic period. You're a scribe, trained from childhood in the complex art of reading and writing the hundreds of hieroglyphic signs. Your patron is a nobleman who wants his genealogy recorded, tracing his descent from gods and legendary kings. You prepare your bark paper, coating it with lime to create a smooth white surface, then fold it accordion style to create pages. You mix your paints, black from soot, red from hematite, blue from indigo, and a special clay that creates the luminous Maya blue pigment, yellow from various earths. Your brushes are made from animal hair or plant fibers, and your hand is steady from years of practice. You begin to paint, each glyph a small work of art, combining images and sounds in ways that can be read multiple ways depending on context. You record not just names and dates, but the spiritual significance of events, the way the stars aligned when the patron's great-grandfather ascended to power, the ritual sacrifices that maintained cosmic order, the victories in war that brought glory and captives. When you're finished, this codex will be placed in the patron's family shrine, to be consulted during important ceremonies, perhaps eventually to be included in his tomb. You can't imagine that in 800 years, books like this will be so rare that each surviving page will be priceless, that scholars will spend lifetimes trying to understand what you've written, that your casual notations about astronomical events will revolutionize our understanding of Mayan science. And you certainly can't imagine that most of your work, most of the books created by your fellow scribes across generations, will be gathered into a pile and set on fire by foreigners who believe your sacred texts are demonic. The archive you're building, one codex at a time, will burn before anyone can catalog its contents or appreciate its scope. We still don't know the full extent of what was lost in the burning of Mayan books, and we never will. Every time epigraphers decode another inscription or excavate another site, we get small glimpses of Mayan intellectual achievement, but these are fragments of a shattered mirror, reflecting only pieces of a larger image. The burned archive of the Maya represents not just the destruction of books but the attempted erasure of an entire way of knowing, a sophisticated intellectual tradition that understood mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and spirituality in ways that were different from but no less valid than European knowledge systems. What remedies did Mayan healers know that we've forgotten? What agricultural techniques did they develop over thousands of years of experimentation? What stories did they tell about the origins of their cities, their understanding of human nature, their explanations for why things are the way they are? These questions haunt Mayan studies, and while we've made tremendous progress in recent decades, reconstructing much of Mayan history, understanding their political systems, appreciating their artistic achievements, we're always aware of the enormous gap in our knowledge caused by that 16th century bonfire. The Khmer Empire, centered in what is now Cambodia, reached its zenith between the 9th and 15th centuries CE, creating one of the most powerful states in Southeast Asia and leaving behind architectural monuments that continue to astonish modern visitors. Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century under Suryavarman II, is the largest religious structure in the world, covering 162.6 hectares with a moat 190 meters wide surrounding the main complex. The temple complex required somewhere around 5 million tons of sandstone to construct, blocks that were quarried from Phnom Kulen quarries 40 kilometers away and transported by boat and elephant. The bas-reliefs covering the galleries stretch for hundreds of meters and depict scenes from Hindu epics, historical battles, and the 37 heavens and 32 hells of Hindu mythology, with such intricate detail that scholars are still discovering new elements in the carvings. At its peak in the 12th century, the city of Angkor may have had a population approaching 1 million people, making it one of the largest pre-industrial cities in the world, with an urban sprawl covering nearly 3,000 square kilometers when you include the outlying temples, reservoirs, and residential areas. The Khmer engineered massive water management systems, including enormous reservoirs called barays. The West Baray alone measures 8 kilometers by 2.1 kilometers. That stored water for irrigation during the dry season and helped support rice cultivation that could feed the huge population. Their hydraulic engineering was so sophisticated that scholars are still debating exactly how the system worked and whether it might have contributed to the empire's eventual decline. But here's what we've lost. The Khmer kept extensive written records, but almost all of them were written on perishable materials, palm leaf manuscripts that have decomposed in the tropical climate, leaving only a handful of surviving texts from later periods and forcing us to reconstruct Khmer history largely from inscriptions on stone temples and from the accounts of Chinese diplomats who visited Angkor. The problem with stone inscriptions is that they're selective, focusing on royal propaganda, temple dedications, and religious donations. They tell us about kings and gods but very little about the daily lives of ordinary people, about trade and economy, about the intellectual life of the empire beyond what can be inferred from the monuments. Zhou Deguan, a Chinese diplomat who visited Angkor in 1296 to 1297, wrote an account called The Customs of Cambodia that provides our most detailed eyewitness description of the city and its culture. He describes a city of wooden houses for commoners and only temples and palaces built of stone, which explains why most of Angkor has vanished. The houses rotted away centuries ago, leaving only the religious and royal structures. He mentions that the Khmer kept many books and records, that education was valued, that they had a sophisticated legal system. But where are those books? Where are the legal codes, the literature, the scientific texts? Gone, decomposed, consumed by humidity and insects, and the relentless decay of organic matter. This represents a particularly frustrating kind of burned archive because it wasn't actually burned, it simply dissolved. The Khmer didn't suffer a catastrophic event like the Library of Alexandria or a deliberate destruction like the Mayan codices. Instead, their intellectual heritage was written on materials that couldn't survive the environment they lived in. Palm leaf manuscripts, if carefully maintained in the right conditions, can last hundreds of years, and libraries in places like Sri Lanka and Thailand preserve palm leaf texts dating back centuries. But in Cambodia, the combination of heat, humidity, monsoons, and periods of political instability meant that manuscript collections weren't preserved. The result is that we know the Khmer had a literary tradition, inscriptions reference texts and quote from works that no longer exist, but we have almost no surviving examples from the Angkor period. The oldest surviving Cambodian palm leaf manuscript dates from the 16th century, well after Angkor's decline. Everything earlier is gone. Imagine if we had to understand ancient Greece based solely on building inscriptions and the reports of Roman tourists, without access to Homer, Herodotus, Plato, Aristotle, or the Greek dramatists. That's essentially the situation with Angkor. Now let's consider what this means for our understanding of the empire. We can trace the outline of Khmer history through the stone inscriptions, the foundation of the empire by Jayavarman II in 802 CE, the succession of kings who built the great temples, the wars with the Cham people of what is now Vietnam, the gradual shift from Hinduism to Buddhism as the dominant religion, the eventual abandonment of Angkor in the 15th century. But the why and how of these events is often unclear. Why did Angkor fall? The traditional explanation blamed Thai invasions, and it's true that the Ayutthaya kingdom sacked Angkor in 1431, but modern scholars recognize that the city was already in decline by that point. Climate change is now considered a major factor. Analysis of tree rings and other climate proxies suggests that the region experienced severe droughts interspersed with intense monsoons in the 14th and 15th centuries, which may have disrupted the carefully balanced water management system that Angkor depended on. If the reservoirs couldn't be filled during droughts, or if monsoons caused flooding that damaged the canals, the agricultural base of the empire would have been threatened. There's also evidence that the water management system itself may have contributed to problems. Deforestation for rice cultivation and temple construction could have increased erosion, and the canals may have become clogged with sediment over time. But these are theories built on physical evidence. What we're missing is the human perspective. What did the people of Angkor think was happening as their city declined? Did they understand the environmental challenges they faced? What solutions did they attempt? Were there debates among scholars and administrators about how to respond? Did religious leaders interpret the droughts as divine punishment? We can speculate, but without written records, we're reading a story with half the pages torn out. There are tantalizing hints of lost knowledge in the temples themselves. The carvings at Angkor would include astronomical elements. The central tower aligns with the spring equinox, and various measurements in the temple correspond to cosmic cycles according to Hindu cosmology. The Khmer clearly had sophisticated astronomical knowledge, but we don't have the treatises that would have explained their calculations. They were skilled metallurgists. Bronze and iron artifacts show advanced techniques, but we don't have the technical manuals. They grew crops and managed forests in ways that sustained a huge population in a challenging environment, but we don't have the agricultural texts. And then there are the mysteries that might never be solved because the evidence has decomposed. Some researchers have speculated about astronomical observatories or scientific instruments made of wood or other perishable materials. Others wonder whether the Khmer had navigational texts and maps that would reveal their connections with other Southeast Asian cultures and beyond. There are theories, some quite speculative, about the Khmer possessing knowledge inherited from earlier civilizations or having contacts with distant lands that brought exotic knowledge to Angkor. Some of the iconography in the temples has been interpreted as showing astronomical knowledge that seems remarkably advanced, such as carvings that might depict planetary conjunctions or eclipses calculated far into the future. Picture yourself as a scholar in 12th century Angkor, perhaps an astronomer priest responsible for calculating auspicious dates for royal ceremonies and agricultural rituals. You work in a wooden building near one of the great temples, surrounded by palm leaf manuscripts bound with silk cords. Some of these texts are copies of Indian astronomical treatises brought to Cambodia centuries ago. Others are original Khmer works building on that foundation with observations made from your own latitude. You've recorded the positions of planets, timed eclipses, noted the appearances of comets. You've developed tables that predict the movements of celestial bodies with impressive accuracy. You consult these texts when the king needs to know the best day to begin a building project, or when farmers need guidance on when to plant. Your knowledge is valued, and you train students who will continue this work after you're gone. The library you work in contains not just astronomical texts but histories of the kingdom, religious commentaries, medical treatises, poetry, legal documents. It's the intellectual heart of the empire, a repository of everything your culture has learned and discovered over generations. But your library is made of wood, and your books are palm leaves. Within a few centuries, after periods of war, climate stress, and social upheaval, the building will collapse, the palm leaves will crumble, and everything you knew will be forgotten. Future archaeologists will marvel at the stone temples and wonder how such monuments were built, but they won't be able to read your calculations or understand the sophisticated knowledge that your society possessed because the archive that contained that knowledge has dissolved into the soil. We still don't know the full scope of Khmer intellectual achievement, and we likely never will unless archaeological methods improve to the point where we can recover traces of organic text from soil samples or unless some miraculous cache of palm leaf manuscripts is discovered in a perfectly preserved environment. The burned, or rather dissolved, archive of the Khmer Empire reminds us that the greatest threats to knowledge aren't always dramatic fires or deliberate destruction. Sometimes it's simply the slow, silent work of time and nature, consuming the record of human thought as thoroughly as any flame, leaving behind only the skeleton of a civilization without its voice. The Library of Constantinople, also known as the Imperial Library of Constantinople, was founded by the Roman Emperor Constantius II in 357 CE and housed in the capital of the Byzantine Empire. A city that served as the guardian of classical learning throughout the Middle Ages while much of Western Europe descended into relative cultural darkness following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. At its height, the library reportedly contained 120,000 volumes, making it the most extensive collection of texts in the Christian world, preserving Greek and Roman classics along with Christian theological works, scientific treatises, historical chronicles, and literary works from across the Byzantine territories. The library was part of a larger complex that included the imperial palace, and access was restricted primarily to scholars, clerics, and members of the imperial court. Unlike the Library of Alexandria, which was more of a research institution, the Constantinople Library functioned more as a repository and preservation facility, though scholars did use it for study and copying. The Byzantines were meticulous preservers of texts, and scriptoria throughout the empire produced copies of important works, which is why so much of what we know about ancient Greece and Rome comes to us through Byzantine manuscripts. The library survived various threats over its centuries of existence: earthquakes, fires, political upheavals, and iconoclastic controversies during which religious images and sometimes texts were destroyed. But it endured, adapting and growing even as the empire around it contracted under pressure from external enemies. But here's the catastrophe. The library was largely destroyed during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Crusader armies, ostensibly on their way to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, instead attacked and sacked Constantinople, the largest Christian city in the world. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Crusaders had been diverted by Venetian political machinations and Byzantine succession disputes, but the result was one of the most brutal sackings in medieval history. For 3 days, Western Christian soldiers looted and burned the Eastern Christian city, destroying or stealing countless treasures. The great palace was ransacked, churches were desecrated for their gold and relics, and the library was devastated. Contemporary accounts describe priceless manuscripts being destroyed as soldiers tore apart books looking for gold illuminations or simply burned them for warmth or entertainment. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine historian who witnessed the sack, wrote that the Crusaders trampled the images under their feet, cast the sacred vessels into places of dishonor, and showed no respect for learning or culture. The exact details of the library's destruction are unclear. Sources from the period are fragmentary and biased, but it's certain that enormous losses occurred. Some scholars estimate that 3/4 of the collection was destroyed, with surviving texts scattered across Western Europe as booty or hidden by Byzantine scholars who later fled the city. The irony is almost unbearable. Western Europeans, whose ancestors had largely abandoned classical learning, destroyed the library that had preserved that learning through centuries of darkness. Works that had survived the fall of Rome, the closure of Plato's Academy, the burning of Alexandria, now fell to soldiers who couldn't read them and didn't care. We know from catalogs and references in other texts that the Constantinople library held works that are now completely lost, complete versions of Livy's History of Rome, additional plays by Sophocles and Euripides beyond the handful that survive, scientific works by Hellenistic scholars, alternate versions of texts we have only in fragmentary form, Byzantine commentaries on classical works that might have preserved information from even earlier sources. The library also contained uniquely Byzantine productions, chronicles of the empire's thousand-year history, theological debates that shaped Christian doctrine, military manuals that codified centuries of strategic knowledge, technical treatises on everything from agriculture to siege warfare to navigation. When the Fourth Crusade destroyed this collection, it didn't just burn books. It severed a living connection to the ancient world that the Byzantines had maintained continuously since the days of Constantine the Great. Now, let's talk about what was lost and what managed to survive. Some manuscripts were indeed rescued, either smuggled out before the sack or recovered from the ruins afterward. Byzantine scholars fled to other centers of learning, Nicaea, Trebizond, and eventually Italy, where they would play a crucial role in sparking the Renaissance by bringing Greek texts to Western scholars who were hungry for this knowledge. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 would create another wave of Byzantine refugees carrying manuscripts west, further seeding the rebirth of classical learning in Europe. But for every text that survived, how many were lost? We can compile lists of works we know existed because they're mentioned in other sources, histories, scientific treatises, literary works that were read and quoted by Byzantine scholars but that vanished before they could be transmitted to the West. There are also works whose very existence we can only infer, titles we don't know because they vanished without leaving even a reference in surviving texts. The burned archive of Constantinople is particularly painful because it was so recent in historical terms, just over 800 years ago, and because it was so unnecessary. This wasn't a natural disaster or the inevitable decay of ancient materials. It was deliberate destruction during a military campaign that should never have targeted the city in the first place. There are persistent legends about hidden caches of Byzantine manuscripts, secret libraries walled up during the 1204 sack or the 1453 fall to the Ottomans, waiting to be discovered in forgotten chambers beneath Istanbul. Every so often, archaeologists excavating in Istanbul find Byzantine-era structures, and there's always hope that some lost library might be uncovered. In 2010, construction workers accidentally discovered a Byzantine-era port that had been buried for 1,000 years, complete with the remains of ships, and for a moment there was speculation about finding preserved cargo that might include texts. So far, no major manuscript caches have been found in Istanbul, though important Byzantine texts continue to be discovered in monasteries across Greece, Russia, and Eastern Europe, places where Byzantine culture took root and preserved texts even after the empire's fall. Mount Athos in Greece, with its collection of 20 monasteries, holds one of the largest repositories of Byzantine manuscripts in the world, and scholars are still cataloging and digitizing texts that haven't been widely studied. Occasionally, new work is discovered, usually something that was known to exist but whose text hadn't been found, rather than something completely unknown, and each discovery reminds us of what might still be hidden. Picture yourself in the Imperial Library of Constantinople in, say, the year 1200, just a few years before the catastrophe. You're a scholar working on a commentary on Aristotle, and you have access to texts that have been carefully preserved for centuries. The library is housed in a building near the Great Palace, with vaulted ceilings and shelves filled with codices, parchment books that have replaced the old scrolls. The smell of vellum and ink fills the air, mixed with the scent of the oil lamps that provide light for reading. You're surrounded by the intellectual heritage of millennia, works by Homer and Hesiod, Herodotus and Thucydides, Plato and Aristotle, Euclid and Ptolemy, alongside Christian fathers like Basil and John Chrysostom, Byzantine historians recording the empire's struggles and triumphs, scientific treatises on medicine and astronomy and geography. You know some of these works are unique copies, that if something happened to this library, knowledge would be lost. But Constantinople has stood for nearly 850 years, surviving barbarian invasions, Persian and Arab sieges, civil wars, and religious controversies. Surely it will stand forever. You can't imagine that in 4 years, soldiers who call themselves Christians will smash through the city walls and put everything you value to the torch. You can't imagine that the careful work of generations of scribes, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, will be destroyed in 3 days of looting and burning. But that's exactly what will happen, and future scholars will curse the Fourth Crusade not just for its political consequences, but for the irreplaceable knowledge it destroyed. We still don't know the full extent of what was lost in the sack of Constantinople's library, but we know it was catastrophic. Every time a classical scholar discovers a gap in the transmission of texts, a work that was known and quoted in the 12th century but that doesn't appear in manuscripts after 1204, there's a strong possibility that the only copies were destroyed in that sack. The burned archive of Constantinople represents the last great destruction of classical and Byzantine knowledge before the Renaissance, and it came at the hands not of invading barbarians or hostile foreigners but of fellow Christians who should have been protecting, not destroying, the repositories of Christian civilization. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that it was preventable, unnecessary, and recognized even at the time as an atrocity. And yet it happened, and 1,000 years of careful preservation came to a violent end, leaving us with fragments when we might have had the whole. The ancient city of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, stood on the eastern bank of the Tigris River near modern-day Mosul, Iraq, and at its peak in the 7th century BC under King Sennacherib, it was possibly the largest city in the world, covering 750 hectares with a population estimated at 100,000 to 150,000 people. The city was surrounded by walls 12 kilometers long and up to 40 meters thick in places, pierced by 15 great gates, each one named and decorated with bull and lion statues. But the glory of Nineveh, more than its walls or palaces, was the Library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, who ruled from 668 to 627 BC and was one of the few ancient Near Eastern kings who could actually read and write. Ashurbanipal was obsessed with collecting knowledge, and he sent scribes throughout his empire and beyond to copy or confiscate tablets from libraries and archives in conquered cities. His collection ultimately contained somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, making it the largest library in the ancient Near East and one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history when it was excavated in the 19th century. The tablets cover an extraordinary range of subjects: omens and divination, medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, lexicons and dictionaries, historical chronicles, royal correspondence, treaties and legal documents, prayers and hymns, mythology and epic literature. The most famous text from the library is the Epic of Gilgamesh, an ancient Mesopotamian poem dating back to the 3rd millennium BC, but preserved in its most complete form in Ashurbanipal's library. This masterwork of world literature, which influenced everything from the Bible to modern fantasy novels, survived only because Ashurbanipal's scribes copied it onto clay tablets that could withstand the destruction of the library itself. And that's the crucial difference between Ashurbanipal's library and other burned archives. The tablets were clay, and when Nineveh was sacked and burned in 612 BC by a coalition of Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians who finally destroyed the Assyrian Empire, the fire that consumed the city's wooden structures actually baked the clay tablets, hardening them and preserving them for 2,600 years. When British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard and his assistant Hormuzd Ras Sam excavated the site in the 1840s and 1850s, they found thousands upon thousands of tablets and fragments in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace. The British Museum now holds the majority of these tablets, representing one of the most important cuneiform collections in the world. But here's where the loss comes in. When Layard and Ras Sam excavated Nineveh, archaeological methods were primitive by modern standards. They were essentially treasure hunters, looking for spectacular artifacts to ship back to London for display, and they didn't employ the systematic recording and preservation techniques that modern archaeologists would use. Thousands of tablets were excavated without proper documentation of their exact find spots or context. Tablets were broken in the rough handling of excavation and transport. And most critically, the excavations were incomplete. Layard and Ras Sam excavated only portions of the palace complex and didn't discover the full extent of the library. Later excavations in the 20th century found more tablets, but the site was never fully excavated, and portions remain buried. Then, in 2015 and 2016, ISIS militants who had taken control of Mosul bulldozed and blew up ancient sites across the region, including parts of Nineveh, destroying or damaging artifacts and making future excavation more difficult. Some tablets were certainly destroyed in this modern vandalism, though the full extent of the damage is still being assessed. So while the fire of 612 BC paradoxically preserved Ashurbanipal's library, the incomplete excavation and modern destruction mean we don't have access to everything that survived. Now, let's consider what we have and what we're missing. The 25,000 to 30,000 tablets and fragments in museums represent an incredible resource, but they're also maddeningly incomplete. Many tablets are fragmentary, missing portions of text that would be crucial for understanding. Scholars spend careers trying to piece together fragments that might belong to the same tablet, matching edge patterns and text continuity, a process made more difficult by the fact that fragments are scattered across multiple museums and collections. The British Museum's collection alone consists of roughly 30,000 fragments, many of them tiny pieces just a few centimeters across. There are texts we know existed because they're mentioned in catalog tablets from the library. Ashurbanipal kept lists of his holdings, but the actual tablets haven't been found. Either they're still buried in unexcavated portions of Nineveh, or they were destroyed in the sack, or they were damaged beyond recovery, or they were lost in the 19th century excavations. The library also certainly contained tablets from earlier periods of Mesopotamian history, works from the Sumerian and Old Babylonian periods that Ashurbanipal's scribes had copied. Some of these we have in multiple copies from different sites, but others survive only in the Nineveh fragments. If those tablets are too damaged to read or haven't been found, that knowledge is lost. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself is a good example of this problem. We have a reasonably complete version from Ashurbanipal's library, but it's pieced together from multiple tablets, and there are still gaps in the text. Earlier versions of the story exist from other sites, but they're also fragmentary, and scholars have to combine evidence from multiple sources to reconstruct the full narrative. The famous flood story in Tablet 11, which parallels the biblical flood narrative and has fascinated scholars since it was first translated in 1872, is complete, but other sections have missing lines or damaged passages. Imagine if we only had fragmentary copies of the Odyssey, and had to guess at what Homer wrote in the missing sections. That's the situation with much of Mesopotamian literature. And Gilgamesh is one of the better preserved texts. There are other works we have only in tiny fragments, enough to know they existed and to glimpse their subject matter, but not enough to understand them fully. There are astronomical texts from Ashurbanipal's library that record observations going back centuries, potentially containing data on eclipses, planetary movements, and comets that could be valuable to modern astronomers studying ancient celestial events. But many of these tablets are fragmentary, and the observations they record are therefore incomplete. There are medical texts describing symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, some of which show surprising sophistication and some of which are baffling mixtures of rational medicine and magical thinking. But we can't fully evaluate Mesopotamian medical knowledge because we have only partial access to their texts. Picture yourself as one of Ashurbanipal's scribes, sitting in a palace room in Nineveh around 640 BC, carefully copying a text from an old tablet that's been brought from the library of a conquered city, perhaps Babylon or Uruk. You're working on a literary text, maybe a creation myth or a wisdom text, using a stylus to impress wedge-shaped marks into soft clay. Your training has given you beautiful, clear handwriting, and you take pride in your work. You know that you're preserving knowledge, that without your efforts this text might be lost as the original tablet crumbles with age. You don't know that your king, for all his learning and his love of books, is presiding over an empire in its final days, that Assyrian power is overextended, that rebellions and invasions are coming that will overwhelm even the mighty walls of Nineveh. You certainly don't know that when the city falls and burns, the fire that consumes the palace will actually bake your tablet hard, preserving it through millennia, or that 2,500 years later, British excavators will dig it from the ruins and ship it across the world to a museum in a foggy island kingdom you've never heard of. And you can't imagine that scholars in the 21st century will use computers to photograph your tablet, create digital 3D models of the cuneiform impressions, and employ artificial intelligence to help decipher damaged sections, piecing together the text you're copying with fragments from dozens of other tablets in a jigsaw puzzle spanning continents and centuries. But that's exactly what's happening now, as modern scholars work to recover the full contents of Ashurbanipal's library from the fragments that survive. We still don't know everything that was in the Library of Nineveh, and we probably never will unless someone develops technology to reconstruct destroyed tablets from traces in the soil, or unless unexcavated portions of the site yield more intact material. But compared to other burned archives, we're remarkably lucky. The clay medium preserved far more than papyrus or palm leaf or even parchment would have, and the 19th century excavators, for all their faults, did recover an enormous amount of material. Current projects to digitize and catalog the cuneiform collections are making the tablets accessible to scholars worldwide, and machine learning algorithms are being developed to help match fragments and even predict missing text based on patterns in similar tablets. The burned archive of Nineveh is still revealing its secrets, slowly, tablet by tablet, fragment by fragment, as patient scholars work to recover the wisdom of ancient Mesopotamia from the clay that has preserved it for 2,600 years. These 6 archives: Alexandria's scrolls consumed by fire and decline, the Indus Valley's undeciphered script lost to time, the Mayan codices burned by zealots, the Khmer manuscripts dissolved by climate, Constantinople's texts scattered by crusaders, and Nineveh's tablets broken and buried, represent more than individual tragedies. Together, they form a pattern, a recurring theme in human history, the fragility of knowledge and the countless ways it can be lost. Every burned archive is a reminder that civilization itself is a precarious achievement, that the accumulated wisdom of generations can vanish in a moment of violence, neglect, or simple bad luck. When we talk about these losses, we're not just mourning old books or ancient texts, we're recognizing that each destroyed archive represents voices silenced, perspectives erased, knowledge that might have changed our understanding of the world or ourselves. The scholars who dedicated their lives to gathering and preserving these collections believed they were building something permanent, creating repositories that would serve humanity for all time. And they failed, not through any fault of their own but because destruction is easier than preservation, because fire spreads faster than scribes can copy texts, because environmental decay is patient and relentless, and because every human institution, no matter how grand, is ultimately vulnerable to the forces of history. Yet there's also something profoundly hopeful in these stories, because humans keep trying. After every burned library, new libraries are built. After every destroyed collection, scholars work to recover what fragments remain. The same species that burns books also writes them, that destroys archives also creates them, and the tension between these two impulses, creation and destruction, preservation and loss, defines much of our history. Modern archaeology and technology are giving us tools our ancestors never had. We can now read texts that were thought to be illegible, using multispectral imaging to reveal faded ink or erased writing. We can reconstruct broken tablets using computer algorithms that match fragments based on shape and text. We can preserve digital copies of manuscripts that are too fragile to handle, making knowledge accessible to scholars worldwide without risking damage to the originals. We can analyze residues and traces in soil samples that might reveal what was once there even when the objects themselves have completely decomposed. And we're building new archives, digital repositories, distributed across multiple servers and locations so that no single disaster can destroy them, to preserve not just texts but images, sounds, videos, and data in formats that we hope will be accessible to future generations. The burned archives also teach us something about the nature of knowledge itself. They show us that what we know about the past is shaped as much by what has been preserved as by what actually happened, that our understanding of ancient civilizations is always partial, always mediated through the accidents of survival and the biases of those who chose what to record and preserve. When we read ancient history, we're reading the version that survived, not necessarily the most accurate or complete version. The Indus Valley people might have had a very different perspective on their own civilization than we can reconstruct from their silent cities and undeciphered seals. The Maya might have explained their world in ways that don't fit the categories we've imposed on them based on stone carvings and the 4 surviving codices. The Byzantines might have understood their own role in history differently than we do, and their lost chronicles might have challenged our assumptions about the Middle Ages and the transition to the Renaissance. Every burned archive represents not just lost information but lost perspectives, alternative ways of understanding that we can never fully recover because the voices that express them have been silenced. And yet, paradoxically, the gaps in our knowledge create spaces for imagination and investigation that drive scholarship forward. The mysteries of the burned archives inspire new generations of archaeologists, linguists, historians, and technologists to develop better methods, ask better questions, and search for new evidence. The undeciphered Indus script has motivated decades of research into ancient writing systems and computational linguistics. The lost Mayan codices have spurred efforts to record and preserve the oral traditions of contemporary Maya communities, recognizing that some knowledge survives in living cultures even when the written records are destroyed. The scattered fragments of Constantinople's library have sent scholars on detective hunts through monastery libraries across Europe and the Middle East, leading to unexpected discoveries. And the incomplete excavation of Nineveh keeps archaeologists returning to the site whenever political conditions permit, hopeful that more tablets remain to be found. The burned archives remind us that there's always more to discover, that the past is not a closed book but an ongoing investigation, and that every new technique or technology might reveal something that has been hidden for centuries. The emotional resonance of these losses is also worth acknowledging. When we contemplate the burning of the Mayan codices or the sack of Constantinople, we're not engaging in abstract intellectual exercise. We're confronting something that should make us angry and sad. These were acts of cultural violence, deliberate destructions motivated by ideology, greed, religious intolerance, or military necessity, and they represented not just the loss of objects but attacks on the human communities that created and valued those objects. The Spanish friars who burned Mayan books were trying to erase indigenous culture, to force conversion by destroying the intellectual foundations of Maya religion and society. The Fourth Crusaders who sacked Constantinople were betraying their own stated values, attacking a Christian city that had preserved classical and Christian learning for centuries. And in our own time, the destruction of archaeological sites by ISIS in Iraq and Syria, including damage to Nineveh, represents a continuation of this pattern, the deliberate erasure of cultural heritage, the attempt to monopolize history by destroying evidence that contradicts a particular narrative. These acts diminish all of us, because they reduce the store of human knowledge and narrow the range of human experience that we can access through historical evidence. But let's end on a note that acknowledges both the losses and the resilience of human knowledge. Yes, the archives burned. Yes, we've lost knowledge that we can never fully recover. Yes, there are gaps in our understanding of the past that we may never be able to fill. But we also have more knowledge of ancient history now than at any previous time in human history. We've deciphered scripts that were unreadable a century ago. We've excavated cities that were forgotten for millennia. We've recovered texts from desert sands and monastery libraries and even palimpsests where one text was scraped off and written over, but modern technology can read the underlying layer. We've learned to extract DNA from ancient skeletons and pollen from soil cores and chemical traces from pottery, revealing aspects of ancient life that no text records. We've mapped trade networks and migration patterns, reconstructed ancient climates and ecosystems, and pushed back the boundaries of what we know about human prehistory. Every year brings new discoveries: a tomb that's been sealed for 3,000 years, a cache of documents in a forgotten cave, a fragment of papyrus reused in the binding of a medieval book. The work of recovering the past continues, patient and incremental, and while we'll never fully restore what was lost in the burned archives, we keep finding pieces, keep filling in the gaps, keep bringing voices from the past back into conversation with the present. The burned archives teach us to value knowledge, to recognize its fragility, and to take responsibility for preserving it. They remind us that we are the custodians of human heritage, and that what we choose to preserve or allow to be destroyed will shape what future generations know about us and about the deep human past. They challenge us to think about what we're creating and preserving for the future, what digital archives we're building that might be vulnerable to technological obsolescence or cyber attacks, what knowledge we're recording and what we're allowing to vanish as languages die and traditional practices are abandoned. And they inspire us to keep digging, keep searching, keep questioning, because somewhere beneath the soil or hidden in a manuscript collection or encoded in a fragment of pottery, there might be answers to questions we're only now learning to ask. The burned archives of history are losses we can never fully repair, but they're also invitations to investigate, to preserve, to value the complex tapestry of human knowledge, and to recognize that every piece of that tapestry matters, every voice from the past deserves to be heard, and every mystery solved brings us closer to understanding not just ancient civilizations but ourselves. Keep digging. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting for someone curious and persistent enough to uncover them, to brush away the dust and ash of centuries, and to bring them back into the light where they can once again contribute to our shared human story.